but I guess it's on the table. Obviously we'd have to check. Well, she'd have to specify, because you have to prepare the things, fill out a document, and there's some rigmarole. They may charge more. Yeah. Devotees, Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastyachadeshatarane Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchkalpatrubhyascha kripas sindhubhya evacha, patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Let's see what now. Right. So Srila Prabhupada's in Calcutta still. From Prabhupada's first day in Calcutta, he had thought of going to Mayapur, the sacred birthplace of Lord Chaitanya. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, father of Srila Prabhupada's spiritual master and pioneer in spreading Lord Chaitanya's teachings beyond India, had longed for the day when Americans and Europeans would join with their Bengali brothers in Mayapur, and South Africans. Yes, definitely. He just mentioned Europeans and Americans, but he was thinking of South Africans. Chanting the holy names, Prabhupada wanted to purchase land, establish a Mayapur center for his Western disciples, and fulfill the dream of his spiritual predecessors. He had written to one of his godbrothers, quote, I wish to go to Mayapur to pay my respects to our beloved spiritual master, His Divine Grace Sri Srila Prabhupada, as well as to complete the purchase of the land. You know, an interesting thing Mother Sukumari mentioned yesterday, asked a question yesterday about if a devotee, feels that it would offend Prabhupada if they become initiated by one of his disciples. So, anyway, I said something about it yesterday, but just seeing this and just thinking, mention of Prabhupada and his spiritual master, when Srila Prabhupada was physically present, there were, not many at all, but there were a handful of ISKCON devotees, at least in ISKCON for a while, who felt that Prabhupada wasn't good enough, and they openly said, if only Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was still present, then it would be all right. And there were at least one or two. One thought, if only Bhaktivinoda Thakur was present. And there was one who thought, if only Rupa Goswami was present. Seriously. because they had problems, with the other arrangements. But there were definitely a few devotees, and they ended up leaving ISKCON, understandably, who felt that Prabhupada shouldn't be the spiritual master, but rather Srila Bhaktisiddhanta should be. And of course there are Ritviks who don't just feel that it might be an offense to Prabhupada to be initiated by one of his disciples, but there are those who think that Prabhupada's disciples shouldn't initiate anyone at all. Yeah, and the parampara finished with Srila Prabhupada, and one should be initiated by Srila Prabhupada. Anyway, it just struck me here. So, yes. So if Jagmohan Prabhu will accompany us to finish this transaction, it will be very kind of him, and I hope you will kindly request him to accompany us." Unquote. The followers of Lord Chaitanya accept Mayapur, 110 miles north of Calcutta, to be identical with Vrindavan. 5,000 years ago, Lord Krishna lived in Vrindavan, performing his childhood pastimes, and 500 years ago, Lord Krishna appeared in Mayapur as Lord Chaitanya. For the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, therefore, Mayapur and Vrindavan are the two most dear and sacred places on earth. What better place for ISKCON to have its world headquarters than in Mayapur? But despite various attempts over the past several years, Srila Prabhupada had still not acquired property there. He had gone to Mayapur with Achyutananda in 1967, seen a plot of land, and asked Achyutananda to try and get it. But Achyutananda and the Mohammedan owner had never reached an agreement. Some of Prabhupada's godbrothers had temples and property in Mayapur, but they wouldn't help. Some even seemed to be working against him. When Prabhupada had written one of his godbrothers in Mayapur, asking him to help Achyutananda secure land, the godbrother's secretary had replied that he was unable to do so. The secretary had remarked, "One must be very fortunate to get land in Mayapur." Wow, gosh, unbelievable. Prabhupada criticized his godbrother's uncooperative spirit. He was becoming impatient. "Why are we not able to get the land in Mayapur?" he asked his disciples. "This is dragging on for 300 years. Again he wrote one of his godbrothers, quote, "Regarding propagating the name of Sri Mayapur as birthplace of Lord Chaitanya, it is going on regularly in our different literatures and books. If you kindly take the trouble of coming here conveniently, I can show you how we're giving publicity to the birth site of Lord Chaitanya. Perhaps you know that I begged from His Holiness Shripad Tirtha Maharaj a little piece of land at Mayapur for constructing a home for my Western disciples, but he refused the proposal. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur wanted that the American and European devotees would come to Mayapur, and the prophecy is now fulfilled. Unfortunately, they're loitering in the streets of Calcutta without having a suitable place at Mayapur. Do you think it is all right?" unquote. Accompanied by a small party of men, Prabhupada took the train to Navadvip, just across the Ganges from Mayapur. There they were met by members of the Devananda Mutt. Riding in rickshaws to the Devananda Mutt, the devotees were charmed by the rural atmosphere of Navadvip. Everything was lush from the rainy season, and the devotees found their romantic expectations of India now being fulfilled as they proceeded along roads lined with tropical vegetation. At the Devananda Mutt, Prabhupada and his disciples were given special prasadam and good accommodations. Then the rains returned. Day after day the rains came, and the Ganges rose higher and higher until crossing the swift river into Mayapur became impossible. Since the rains were not likely to abate soon, Prabhupada decided to leave. He and his disciples boarded an early morning train to Calcutta. The tracks were flooded. Repeatedly, the train had to stop, once for more than 8 hours. The heat and the crowds of passengers constantly passing through the car made the wait torturous for the devotees. Prabhupada asked one of his disciples to take a rickshaw and try to arrange better transportation. Nothing was available. At last the train continued toward Calcutta, only to stop at the next station, where all the passengers changed to another train. Finally, Prabhupada reached Calcutta and Mr. Das Gupta's home. Maybe Lord Chaitanya does not want us to establish our headquarters in Mayapur, Prabhupada said. The two purposes in his mind, establishing a place in Calcutta and purchasing land in Mayapur, he had not accomplished. Prabhupada continued holding programs in people's homes and talking with guests in his room. One day, a Mr. Dandharya visited Prabhupada and mentioned Bombay's upcoming Sadhu Samaj, a gathering of the most important sadhus in India. It was to be held at Chowpatty Beach and promised to be a big affair. Mr. Dandharya requested Prabhupada to attend, and Prabhupada accepted. Bombay, October 1970. Responding to Srila Prabhupada's request for more disciples to join him in India, a group of 20 American devotees traveled to Brussels and took an inexpensive flight aboard a propeller-driven craft to Bombay. At the airport, while the devotees were wondering where they should go, Mr. Kailash Seksaria, a wealthy Bombay businessman and nephew of Mr. Dandharya, approached them with a letter from Prabhupada. Mr. Seksaria had arranged for several cars, and he escorted the devotees to his home in an affluent Bombay residential area on Marine Drive. He fed them and provided them with living quarters. 2 days later, a telegram arrived informing the devotees and their host that Prabhupada would be arriving the next day. A telegram not a telephone call. Because in those days, to make a phone call in India, to India, in India, I mean, a lot of the time it's just not possible. Yes. Okay. Prabhupada arrived at the Bombay airport, and after an enthusiastic reception, rode with Mr. Seksaria to his home. Marine Drive runs along the seashore, and the houses lining it belong to the very rich. Mr. Seksaria's residence was 7 stories, and he offered Srila Prabhupada the first floor with its large rooms overlooking the Arabian Sea. Bombay, Prabhupada said, was India's most materialistic city. It was the nation's movie capital and the city where, more than in any other Indian city, the people wore Western dress. The quote-unquote gateway to India. It boasted the most industries, the most businesses, and the most billboards. It was a cosmopolitan melting pot of cultures and religions, but had none of the Naxalite terrorism of Calcutta or the heavy political atmosphere of New Delhi. Nor did it have the aristocratic families who worshipped Lord Chaitanya and his Sankirtan movement. But it had its own advantages for preaching, Prabhupada said. It was a city of wealth, with many pious citizens who were intelligent and quick to adopt a good idea. He predicted Bombay would be a favorable city for Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada's first Bombay preaching engagement was at a gathering of sadhus. I guess it's the same program. Anyway, at a gathering of sadhus, a pandal in an open field just a few blocks from Mr. Seksaria's home. Prabhupada's disciples had also been invited, and they arrived several hours before Prabhupada. The array of Indian sadhus sitting on stage in long rows startled the devotees. Some of the sadhus were bearded, some shaven-headed, some with long matted hair and holding tridents, some covered with ashes, some adorned with beads and clay markings. The devotees were amazed, and many of the sadhus, on seeing the white-skinned Vaishnavas, were also amazed. When the devotees came on stage and began their kirtan, the audience responded by clapping in rhythm and chanting. Afterward, on the advice of Mr. Seksaria, the devotees took their kirtan out into the streets, and many in the audience followed. That evening, the devotees returned to the pandal with Prabhupada. Prabhupada sat on a raised platform, and his disciples sat at his feet. After having 3 of his disciples speak in English, Prabhupada spoke in Hindi, while the audience of more than 500 listened silently. After his lecture, he came down from the platform, and a crowd gathered around him, touching his feet and following him to his car. When Prabhupada heard from his disciples of their spontaneous kirtan through the streets of Bombay, he said they should go to the busiest bazaars and chant daily. So they did. Wherever large numbers of people gathered, the devotees would go and chant. They were strong, youthful, exuberant, and faithful, and they would chant in the streets for 3 or 4 hours each day. Although Prabhupada did not physically go into the streets chanting with his disciples, he was with them by his instructions and by his presence before they went out in the morning and when they returned in the evening. They were chanting because he had told them to, and they knew that chanting was the natural activity of the soul. Everyone should chant. The devotees knew that at the end of life, they would go back home, back to Godhead. And better than that, at the end of the day, they would go back to Marine Drive to Prabhupada, who would smile and encourage them. Radio stations and newspapers took note of the Western devotees chanting in the city. One article appeared in the October 10th edition of the Times of India. Quote, "A group of Americans, including women with babes in arms, belonging to the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, has been moving around Bombay during the past few days, chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, or Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare." It actually says the Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, or Hare Rama, Hare Rama. Anyway, I tell you, some of these people, we get on Facebook, we get Hindu people from India, the people who live in India, and they don't know the Hare Krishna mantra. They don't know it. Anyway, what can you say? So yes, chanting to the accompaniment of cymbals, castanets, and drums, mridangams. Okay, so this is continuing the article. Can the materialistic West, or at any rate a microscopic part of it, have turned at last to embrace the spiritualism of the East? I met several of the kirtan chanting Americans who have come here to attend the 7th All India Conference at the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, which begins here today, and was at once struck by their sincerity and utter surrender to the cult they have adopted. The Vaishnavas of Mathura could not be so guileless, I thought, as this band of bhakti enthusiasts. The sand of Chowpatty Beach was fine and clean. The audience numbered in the thousands. Sadhus sat on stage, Prabhupada and his followers among them. It was twilight. The sky above the Arabian Sea was cloudy, and a pleasant breeze was stirring. There had already been 2 lectures expounding the Mayavad philosophy, and now it was time for Prabhupada to speak, the last scheduled speaker of the evening. The audience was eager to hear him. His accomplishments in the West had caused great curiosity, especially now that he had arrived in Bombay and his devotees were chanting daily in public. Prabhupada's disciples, bored and exasperated by the preceding 2 hours of Hindi oratory, could scarcely wait any longer for Prabhupada to speak. But Prabhupada, instead of addressing the audience, turned to his disciples and said, "Begin chanting." As soon as the devotees began the kirtan, little Saraswati stood and began to dance. Following her, the other devotees rose and began to dance. As the kirtan came alive with mridangas and kartals, the dancing and chanting of the devotees seemed to disturb some of the sadhus on stage, who rose one by one and left. The audience, however, responded enthusiastically, many of them standing and clapping. After 5 minutes of ecstatic kirtan, the devotees spontaneously jumped down onto the sand and headed toward the audience. Thousands in the crowd rose to their feet and began to move along with the devotees in a dance, backward and forward. Indians began crying in uncontrolled happiness, overwhelmed by the genuine Krishna bhakti of these foreigners. Never before had such a thing happened. Policemen and press reporters joined in the chanting and dancing. Chowpatty Beach was in an uproar of Hare Krishna Kirtan, as Prabhupada and his disciples showed the potency of Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement. After about 10 minutes, the kirtan ended, though a tumultuous unrest pervaded the talkative crowd. 15 minutes elapsed before all the people returned to their seats and the program could continue. The devotees had left the stage and taken their seats on the ground level, leaving Prabhupada alone on stage. Prabhupada's voice echoed over the public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, I was requested to speak in Hindi, but I'm not very much accustomed to speak in Hindi. Therefore, the authorities in this meeting have allowed me to speak in English. I hope you will follow me, because it is Bombay and most people will be speaking English. The problem is, as this evening's speaker, His Holiness Swami Akhandanandji, spoke to you, how we can make everyone accustomed to take up good habits, sad achar. I think in this age, Kali Yuga, there are many faults." Prabhupada went on to explain the power of Lord Chaitanya's movement to clean the hearts of everyone. He referred to the 2 great rogues whom Lord Chaitanya had delivered, Jagai and Madai. Quote, "Now we are saving wholesale Jagais and Madais. Therefore, if we want peace, if we want to be situated on the Sad Achar platform, then we must spread the Harinam Mahamantra all over the world. And it has been practically proven. The American and European Vaishnavas who have come here, who have chanted Hare Krishna mantra, they were cow flesh eaters, they were drunkards, they were illicit sex mongers, they were all kinds of gamblers. But having taken to this Krishna consciousness movement, they've given up everything abominable. Sad Achar has come automatically. They are no more eat-meaters. They are no more gamblers. They are no more illicit sex mongers. They are no more intoxicators. They do not even take tea. They do not even take coffee. They do not even smoke, which I think is very rare to be found in India. But they have given up. Why? Because they have taken to this Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada ended his talk after about 5 minutes. I do not feel that I have to say very much. You can see what is the result of Krishna consciousness. It is not something artificial. It is there in everyone. I have not done anything magical, but this Krishna consciousness is present in all of us. We simply have to revive it. The audience responded with cheers and a great round of applause. Prabhupada, with greater force and eloquence than the long-winded Mayavadis, had shown the essence of spiritual life, ecstatic chanting of the holy names, and he had offered the living testimony of his American disciples. For the next week, Prabhupada and his disciples were the talk of Bombay, and they began receiving many invitations to speak and perform kirtan throughout the city. The Times Weekly's coverage of the Sadhu Samaj spotlighted the memorable presence of Srila Prabhupada and his disciples. Okay, this is quote from the Times Weekly. A group of 20 Americans, members of the Hare Krishna delegation, took over the dais. The air was filled with the beating of mridangas, the clash of cymbals, and the music of the Mahamantra. Swaying from side to side, their tufts of hair tossing in the breeze, they chanted Hare Krishna. One graying reporter, whom I had always regarded as a particularly unsentimental person, said to me in an emotion-choked voice, "Do you realize what is happening? Very soon, Hinduism is going to sweep the West. The Hare Krishna movement will compensate for all of our loss at the hands of padres through the centuries." The padres are the Christian preachers. Yeah. We had one in my school. I went to an Anglican school, and we went to chapel every day. Haribol. Every day. For how many years? From the age of 5 to the age of 17. Monday to Friday. And the padre would give us divinity classes. And I tell you, I was a troublesome student. Because I thought, anyway, I was not into it. And he would get upset with me sometimes. I would ask questions he couldn't answer. Hare Krishna, devotees. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Any comment or question? Okay. Haribol. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. What happened? Thank you. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Mother Yashodarani, please come. You deserve a lot more. Hare Krishna devotees, Hari Bol.